Okay, Brett, it looks like I don't see Tom Hilton. Are you still waiting for Tom, or was he not able to attend today?
Tom is here live in council.
Oh, gotcha. I see you now. I couldn't see the video there before. Good afternoon, Councilor Hilton.
Good afternoon, Mayor Jones.
All right, looks like we'll just wait one more minute then.
And Mayor, we have some folks in the council chambers here today, so looks like some folks are still filing in.
Great.
So can you just kind of. Okay, Mayor, it looks like we are ready to go here in the council chambers whenever you're ready to start.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the March 16, 2022 work session of the Astoria City Council, and roll call.
Councilor Herman.
Here.
Councilor Rocca.
Here.
Councilor Brownson.
Here.
Councilor Hilton.
Here.
And Mayor Jones.
Here, and I'll just note for the attendees, I know there may be a few people dialed in or in chambers to particularly hear the livability and camping ordinance and derelict vehicle ordinance issues that we're going to discuss. And I'll just note we're going to start off with a forestry session, and then we'll move into the livability and other issues as soon as that's over. So I'll turn it over to you.
So Mayor and Council, I'm going to first have our Public Works Director, Geoff Harrington, come up and give an intro to this issue dealing with our forest resources around our watershed. We also have our City Forester, Ben Hayes, who's going to be giving part of the presentation and update about some things that that have been going on with regards to work and planning and then looking to the future at the watershed, and then talking about some actions that are coming before you here in upcoming weeks. So Geoff, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so this is the first year that we're going to change our format a little bit on how we present our forest projects. Typically, we have a forest resource management plan, and typically we had brought before council the different items that are needing to be approved. And this approach here, which is outlined in our Forest Resource Stewardship Plan, which is our new updated plan, available on the city website under Public Works, Public Information, changes that format a little bit to where we're going to come to council once a year now with a work session presentation to talk about all the activities that will take place over the entire year. And then in addition to that, as each item that needs approval comes up, we will come to council. For example, the timber harvest project for the year will come to council. It'll be coming to the 21st meeting for authorization to put it out, and then it'll come back for authorization to award. And then other activities, road maintenance, things like that will just be done after an approved budget. So this is an opportunity too for us to explain what will be incorporated into the capital improvement plan budget regarding forest resource management. So this plan is typically referred to as an annual operations plan or operating plan. And this year, what we have that's unique above typical years is some very serious road improvement work that we need to do, including not just our typical road maintenance, but a repair of a series of failing culverts that we're required to remove before they damage our Cedar Creek intake system. And that's the project that I had mentioned during our carbon credit process, that we'd be coming back asking for approximately $100,000 to $150,000 of the carbon credit reserve funds. So we're not asking for that. We're just presenting what we're planning to have in the budget, and that will be actually approved as part of the budget process. Should it be agreed that that's a good way to go to provide stewardship in our forest. So I'm going to introduce our city forester, Ben Hayes, and he's going to cover our activities for the year and answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And we're going pulling up the slides. We'll try to keep this relatively quick so that there's time also for questions that come up. Usually we want to have some discussion. You can go to the next. So as Jeff mentioned, this is a sort of standard like annual operating plan. This is something that's commonly done with other municipalities and private landowners. And this is the first year we're doing this where it kind of says, okay, here are all the activities we're planning for the next year. We'll still individually, as Jeff mentioned, bring those in front of council. But also in future years, this could allow us to permit everything at once. And so with the Oregon Department of Forestry, we would have regulatory approval for everything that's planned for the upcoming year. So we're not doing that this year, but we're going to head it in that direction. And that's what was indicated under the Forest Resources Stewardship Plan. So the things we're going to cover are an update on the timber sale that was completed last summer, really unique timber sale for us, tree planting activities that wrapped up last week, our regular road maintenance, which happens on an annual basis, the Spur 1 crossing and mitigation that we're required to do by ODF and W, 2022 timber sale, and then also just a really quick update on the carbon project. So we'll have to go through it pretty quickly. So you can go to the next slide. So the 2021 Prickly Patches timber sale was unusual because we did not harvest in 2020, primarily due to the carbon project re-verifying that year. So we were inventorying plots in the forest. It would have been pretty complicated to do a harvest project at the exact same time. And then also the pandemic sort of disrupted wood markets and the timing of putting that sale up. We didn't harvest in 2020, which meant that we carried part of that volume over to 2021. We have what's called an annual allowable cut. So an estimate of basically what we say we're going to harvest in a year, which is about a quarter of what the forest grows. So this forest is 3,800 acres. We're cutting about a quarter of what it grows. So 3/4 of what it grows is accumulating there. So we cut more than that last year. It was a variable retention harvest, which allowed us both to break up a stand that had really high risk of wind damage. It was on the property line. It was purchased by Hampton, who has a mill here and a mill down in Tillamook. It was completed on schedule, and they did a really good job completing the work projects associated with it. It was about 335 log truck loads of volume removed, and that retained about a quarter of what was in that stand already. So if you imagine there are 3 trees in a row, we basically took 3 and left 1 throughout the stand. So there's still a lot of forest structure there that's really spaced to emulate like a really old forest condition where this is headed. And the net revenue before the city expenses, such as replanting, was $325,000. So tree planting, we did plant into that 42 acres. We planted 17,000 seedlings. We'd initially ordered 24,000 seedlings, but we got fewer than we had hoped for. But that was sufficient. It was a mix of Western hemlock and Western red cedar. We had a local contractor from Gearhart plant them, and we planted both the timber sales, and then we also have supplemental planting. So areas that were harvested 4 and 5 years ago had really severe mortality with the seedlings, primarily due to that really hot weather last summer. So it kills little trees. And so we got 15 acres of supplemental planting completed with our excess seedlings that we had left over this year, which was great. And we plan to do the rest of that next summer or next winter. So in terms of the road system up there, there's a very extensive road system. We have worked to slowly decommission portions of it, but the main line roads need significant maintenance just to keep them from creating source water issues. So that includes grading, adding rock to the roads, drainage improvements, ditching, adding culverts, things like that. And that work's completed by a combination of city staff and contractors. And Nate Bartlett up there on the watershed is the one who manages that. It's completed as an annual budget item and been right around $45,000 since I've been involved. For 2021, it included repairing a culvert and a replacement on Spur 12, which is adjacent to where we were planning a timber sale this coming year. And that's what that photo on the right-hand side is placing riprap to decrease bank erosion. This is upstream of the Cedar Creek intakes for the water system. Okay, we can go to the next. So Geoff had mentioned we have the Spur 1 crossing. This is both an issue on its own. It's been a long-term issue that has been sort of getting worse for probably the last 5 to 10 years. But also now because of Spur 12's crossing, we have a mitigation requirement with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Oregon Department of Forestry. So we're currently in permitting to make sure that this will comply with our mitigation requirement, that basically that crossing could not be completed in a way that allowed fish passage. And so we need to do fish passage improvements elsewhere in the watershed. And this structure is a very, very significant barrier to fish passage. So this creek comes down. This is Cedar Creek directly above the intakes. It splits. It goes through 2 culverts that you can see there on the right and the left. And our plan is to actually temporarily put the creek in the right-hand side, put a bridge in the left-hand side, put the water back under the bridge. So the creek will now go down and meander to, if you're looking at the image to the left. And then we'll actually abandon the 2 culverts on the right, potentially in place or potentially actually removing them completely. So it'll put the whole creek under a single bridge. And what that meander does is it gives us effectively more river distance to lose elevation over. So if we went in a straight line, it would lose a lot of elevation, whereas you can kind of think of it as switchbacking a little bit. So the creek will come down, it'll slow down and go through and meander under this bridge. So that's been proposed to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and ODF. We estimate the budget roughly at around $150,000 to do this project. And the timing of it is fairly sensitive due to it being both in a fish stream and directly above the Cedar Creek intakes. So we also are proposing a timber sale for 2022. It's pretty much right smack in the middle of the whole watershed with a whole bunch of creeks around it. But as you can see on the right side, it's a very sort of convoluted shape because we're staying well away from all of the creeks. It's 67 acres, and it's primarily a thinning treatment, and then we'll put small, like 1/4 to 3/4 acre gaps in there. So the goal of that is both to thin it. So if an acre of forest only has so much sunlight and so much water, if there are too many trees competing for those resources, trees can become stressed out. And so they're more susceptible to pest and pathogen outbreak or extreme weather events. So by thinning it, you're able to give that energy to the remaining trees. And then the gaps are intended to really break up portions of that stand that are kind of homogeneous. So they're even age, so all the trees are the same age, pretty much the same species, almost all Western hemlock, with a little bit of Douglas fir, and particularly the left side, so that the green indicates the height of the trees, and that left side is very, very homogeneous. So that's where we'll be thinning and then introducing patches to kind of make it look more like the area to the right. It's located on Spur 12. So that culvert that we just talked about 2 slides ago that was done last year is just out the right-hand side of this image to the north. And we do plan to do significant road maintenance as part of this project and culvert replacements. So these are always part of the timber sale. Whoever buys the timber sale actually pays for these road costs. We factor that in up front. The goal here is really to, though, long term, if we're thinking 100 years out, how do we make this forest more resilient, more able to provide reliable quantities of high quality water? And so by increasing complexity and introducing what we call early seral or young forest within an older forest and patches, helps to sort of break up what's right now a not very resilient stand and create that condition going forward. Next one. Finally, the carbon project. As I think council knows, it was re-verified successfully in 2020. Our next re-verification will be in 2025. That's if we decide to generate credits in that year. We're maintaining our harvest below 25% of net growth. So keeps us at harvesting 800,000 board feet or less per year. And then we have continued planned forest health and resilience treatments. So those are things that are, you think about a carbon project on the mitigation end, so we're mitigating climate change. We're also thinking through how do we adapt and become more resilient in the face of climate change. So how do we make sure that this forest many years into the future is able to provide those values. And a good example is the foreground of this image is one of the areas that we pre-commercially thinned 2 years ago as part of that, using part of the carbon credit revenue. So that was a project that sort of both used the mitigation funding with the long-term goal of adaptation and resilience. So I think that's it for slides. And we can take questions or discuss.
I'm going to have Ben just talk a little bit about the when we'll have to make the decision on the next carbon credit. 2 years from now, probably.
Yeah, we would make that decision coming right into that re-verification. And what we'll do is we have modeled kind of how many credits would we generate. We have that already. We already have that number. And so we would look and say, okay, does it make sense based on current prices to monetize these or not? And with carbon prices have come up significantly even since we monetized credits in 2020. So I would anticipate that it would probably be best interest to re-verify monetized credits in 2025. Credit generation though will be lower than 2020.
And then if we decide not to sell carbon credits, we'll still have some obligations.
Yeah, so as part of the carbon project, there's both an initial crediting period, and for this project, it's a 20-year crediting period, and every 5 years within that, we have kind of a set of requirements around accounting for saying, basically, we haven't cut down and harvested timber that's already been accounted for in the carbon project. And then from year 20 onwards, we can either elect to go into a second crediting period, or we can go straight to a monitoring period. And so there's a separate set of requirements that is very similar to annual attestations that we've been filing for the last few years. They've just made that requirement now every 5 years, and we anticipate that's what they would basically require for the monitoring period.
So Mayor and councilors, any questions of Ben or Geoff?
Well, I want to say the same thing I say every year when we get a presentation from Ben. We are so fortunate to have such outstanding forest stewardship. And of course, blessed that many decades ago, our predecessors had the foresight to acquire this land over time. And, I'm just so impressed with our responsible forest stewardship and our forest management plan. And the fact that, the harvests that we do are bringing in needed revenue to the community, but done in a sustainable and way that's in accordance with all the best up-to-date forest stewardship practices. And additionally, the fact that we're creating jobs, or we're sustaining jobs in the timber industries with these annual harvests. And these are local jobs by local folks that work in those industries. And it's part of maintaining our heritage and natural resource-based economy. So to me, it's really exciting to get these annual reports. And yeah, that's all I have to say is thanks, Ben, and also thanks, Geoff, for your outstanding oversight of this program.
I would also like to thank Ben for his always clear presentations. I have to say that over 3+ years in listening to them, I have learned a great deal. And I really appreciate your stewardship of our most precious resource. And I hope that future city councils continue this goal of maintaining clean drinking water for the city and a few surrounding communities.
So one last thing I have to add is I have to give credit to Sarah Hammond, who's our administrative assistant for Public Works. She's the one that actually does the bulk of the work. So she helps Ben put these projects out to bid. She does all the documentation. She deals with all the timber companies. She actually tracks all the timber that's being harvested. It kind of scares me when I go by her desk because her spreadsheets have spreadsheets. It's really complicated stuff, way over my head. So I want to give her credit for taking care of that. She does an incredible job, and her accuracy is incredible.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
have,
Go ahead.
I just gonna say, I don't have any questions either, and I just want to second what Councilor Herman and Mayor Jones said. Since I've been on the council, I've just had nothing but appreciation for the good fortune we have to have that watershed, and that we've been able to turn tax credits into really useful dollars for the city. We're still able to harvest and still continue to generate revenue and have a sustainable forest. So, you know, you hear a lot of issues about watersheds around Oregon because many municipalities just don't own their watershed, and to have that luxury so that we can take care of it and maintain it is just huge. And we're just another reason we're lucky to be here. Thank you.
So Mayor, Councilor Hilton, did you have something here to say?
I was going to wait and see if Roger was going to say anything. But
Well, I
I'm
will. I'll just say that certainly I agree with my colleagues on this, and I'm always proud of what we have up there. And I'm glad that, Mr. Mayor, that you included a sort of recognition of our predecessors who had the foresight to do this, to realize that we needed our own watershed. And I've been thinking lately that applies to so many things that make our community, that people in the past have had a lot of foresight. The Column Hill is one of them. That could have been private property. It could have been some rich guy's house, and instead it's a public amenity. Fort Clatsop is another. You know, that was a farm field, and now it's a beautiful forest and an attraction to the city. And the Riverwalk. I mean, these are people who are still living among us, who we know, who had the foresight to create that out of what was a kind of a mess of a rail yard along our riverfront. So we owe a lot to the people who preceded us, and I hope I hope we're doing our best to follow in their footsteps in terms of doing the right thing and foresight.
I just want to thank you all for your dedication to our community and the preservation of our most valuable resource, which is water. Thank you very much, all of you.
All right, so I guess I just wanted to make a comment or two. Or did you have a wrap up on that, Brett, before we launch into the next session?
Just to clarify also that at your next regular meeting on Monday next week, we are going to be having the 2022 timber harvest sale authorization coming to you for consideration. So this was kind of just a presentation that's moving before that consideration next week.
Okay, great. So moving into the next session, I just wanted to kick it off with a few comments. I mean, we've obviously been having quite a number of meetings, presentations, and briefings at various city council meetings for months now. Really, well, years, but particularly so in the last several months, dealing with community livability issues, specifically related in large part to behavioral issues of some of a minority of our, I'll say our houseless population. I won't use the term transient because many of our houseless members are locals that were born and raised in Astoria or in the surrounding towns in Clatsop County. And so we've had a number of very detailed briefings by Chief Spalding on the legal environment that we're operating in. We dealt with at our last meeting what was perceived to be the lowest hanging of the low hanging fruit, which was the shopping cart issue, which essentially affects only one business in town for all practical purposes, which is Safeway, and an ordinance with which the Safeway general manager was consulted and agreed and supported before we moved forward on that, and it'll come back to us at our next meeting, I think. And so the issues of camping, public camping, have been of great concern in the community and raised by a number of our residents and business members for a long time. And as we've been careful to explain at previous meetings, a combination of state legislation that was passed recently, as well as court rulings from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, essentially, and we'll get into more details, but essentially prevent us from prohibiting camping on our public lands unless we provide an alternate site or a designated site that for camping or a shelter. And up until this point, we have chosen not to provide such a site or a shelter that would accommodate the entire houseless population, because of a concern that it would quickly fill up with our current houseless population and then attract a large number of others to fall behind. And where would it stop? Where would we be able to stop providing more encampments? Additionally, quite frankly, the knowledge that whatever encampment area is proposed within Astoria city limits will generate opposition, probably much greater than we've seen with other projects like the church annex in Councilor Hilton's ward, or the CBH facility proposed for Heritage Square. And so these are difficult and thorny challenges, but Chief Spalding, I want to note, has been a leader across the state with an association of the state chiefs of police, looking at any possible ordinance that would help our community improve the livability and have some restrictions on camping that would be to the benefit of the community. And so we're really looking forward to what he has to tell us today on that issue. And I just want to publicly acknowledge, particularly since he's going to be retiring soon, that Chief Spalding has been playing a leadership role across the state in attempting to come up with suitable ordinances that would benefit all of the local communities, not just Astoria. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Brett, to introduce the topic.
Okay. So as the mayor said, this has been a topic of discussion, which has been happening. This is a follow-up from your last work session on February 16th, where we delved into a list of items that we wanted direction from the council to move forward with. We're going to be talking about RVs today. This is something that we're wanting to make sure that staff is on the same page with the council in terms of how to try and address those issues. The chief will touch on those matters first, and then get into the discussion about camping in public spaces and what can be done to be in compliance with case law as well as state law. So Chief Spalding, I'll turn it over to you.
You're muted.
All right, is that better?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, so again, Geoff Spalding, your police chief. Welcome, council and mayor. By way of introduction, on the call is my deputy chief, Eric Halverson, and also Sergeant Andrew Randall, who've also been assisting me greatly with much of the research and helping put together the presentation, et cetera. I will also be deferring to them on some of the topics and allowing them to weigh in if I'm missing something, because most of the areas we're talking about are very complex and have a lot of different angles that I would like to make sure that we cover. As the mayor mentioned, I've been involved with a lot of discussions at the state level with other law enforcement organizations, different attorney firms. And I can tell you, the one thing I can tell you is that we are all struggling with these issues. And we're also struggling to find clarity. Some of the court decisions that have been passed down, the recent legislation, does not always provide the level of detail to ensure that we apply these local ordinance and laws consistently and equitably. So it's left to some of the individual jurisdictions to work through these topics. And we all know that many jurisdictions are being challenged by certain law firms due to some of these areas that are very gray. So it makes it difficult for us to try to seek clarity, and we're doing the best we can, and at the same time also being compassionate. And as all of you have heard at some point in the past, I do want to make it abundantly clear that we are trying to address the bad behavior in the community. This is not an attack on any particular status of individual. And I think it's important to make that distinction. As everybody knows, when somebody has a need for some sort of service and they don't know who to call, they end up calling the police department. We are not always the best people to call for certain situations when you're dealing with someone in a mental health crisis or someone that's dealing with a substance abuse issue, but we are the ones that get called and asked to solve a lot of these social service type issues. So it is a challenge for the organization. But, you know, fortunately, we do have good partners, and we have a great working relationship with CBH, CCA, and many of the other partners in our community. So we are fortunate in that way. A lot of what we're talking about today, again, is to address the complaints that we do receive on a now regular basis, on a daily basis. So this has occupied a lot of our time. We do clearly sense the same frustration that you are all feeling from the community, and frustrations that are voiced by our residents and our visitors in the community about what they call as the deteriorating condition of our community. And again, asking us to address these issues. And therefore, as the mayor mentioned earlier, many of these tools that we want to bring forward are designed to, again, address certain behaviors in the community, which we know is a very small portion of the population of the homeless population. So again, just my standard caveats. Today, we are specifically introducing two specific ordinances that we will be bringing to council at some future date, but we felt it was important because of the nature of these ordinances that we at least preview these and allow input as to direction as to whether, first off, we want to move forward on these, and secondly, if there's certain components that council may feel better about. And also seeking community input before these come back to the council for final approval. So specifically, we will be talking a little bit about recreational vehicles and derelict vehicles in our community, since we're seeing increased calls regarding that problem. We also need to talk about the camping ordinance and specifically identifying potential locations if we choose to move in that direction. And then we also do want to briefly address the topic of addressing the increased garbage and property in our community that we need to address. And then we'll just briefly talk about some other pieces to this that are in progress. As I've mentioned many times, all of these ordinances are somehow interconnected to the one issue that we're trying to address, again, speaking to the bad behavior. And all of them will provide additional tools for the agency. Doesn't mean that we're going to move forward on every one of them, but again, we just want to make council aware of what is out there, what other agencies are doing. And all of these, we're not operating in a vacuum. All of the ordinances that we're looking at have already been applied or in progress in other agencies throughout the state of Oregon. We've also been working and speaking with different attorneys throughout the state, some that have more expertise in this particular area. So we're doing our best to do as much research as possible. I will tell you that I've heard from many an attorney is that all agencies at some point are going to be sued just because of the ambiguity of the laws that we're dealing with. So with that being said, let me, if I have screen sharing privileges, I'm going to move into that now.
Chief, you should have that, I believe.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. All right. Do you see my outline page or the full page?
We see the full page with your next slide in the top right corner.
Okay. Let me see if I can fix that. Does that look better, Brett?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Okay, so when we're talking about the first ordinance bringing forward, we currently have an ordinance that addresses abandoned vehicles and storage of motor vehicles on the street. These are just excerpts from the current city code on prohibited parking, storage of motor vehicles on streets, and abandoned vehicles. And I think when people think about abandoned vehicles, for the most part, they're thinking about vehicles that have been left on the roadway unattended, that people have just lost interest in, either it's not registered, not licensed, and they've walked away from. And those are the types of vehicles that we generally get calls on, that we have to come out and we have to mark the vehicle for 24 hours, tag it. And then if we come back and the vehicle is still there, then we have the ability to cite and or tow the vehicle. At the same time, on these types of situations, we often have the challenge of somebody that has parked or stored their vehicle on the streets, and we go out there and mark the vehicle and they simply move it several feet or move it a block or so away, making it difficult for us to address some of these vehicles, some of which we even consider to be hazards. And I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the tools that many agencies have used is expanding their abandoned vehicle ordinance. And this requires us to think a little bit differently and understand that there is a clear distinction between abandoned vehicles and stored vehicles on the street. So for the purposes of this ordinance, and I will say also that much of the abandoned vehicle language is also addressed in the state and the Oregon revised statutes, and that's where we get our language from in terms of the requirements to mark certain vehicles that are left abandoned on the street. So we would be looking to potentially add additional language that other cities have used in our abandoned vehicle policy to expand the definition to include additional items such as unregistered vehicles. So in our case, we wanted to give a little bit more grace period. And so if the vehicles had been expired for over 90 days, it could potentially be towed. If the vehicle doesn't have license plates on it, and after the officer runs the vehicle identification number and determines that the vehicle is unregistered, they could potentially store it. There are situations where somebody has sold the vehicle and has not transferred it into the new person's name. That would be a situation. And so different situations would be spelled out in this ordinance to allow us additional tools to address certain vehicles, especially vehicles that we would consider it as derelict vehicles. The additional language that we'd also look at are vehicles that have that we would consider could be an immediate danger to the public or an environmental safety risk, such as something that's leaking fluids. We've had vehicles like that in the past that are leaking fluids into the city's drain system. We run the proposed language past our engineering and public works, and they would welcome this addition to our code to address these types of vehicles that are potentially a hazard. Also, it would allow provisions for vehicles that clearly are abandoned, inoperable. Either they don't have an engine, they don't have a transmission, or missing part of the running gear, and that they would be unsafe to drive on the city streets.
Excuse me, Chief.
Sure.
So is the term abandoned sort of potentially, is it in any way problematic when you actually have people who haven't abandoned it, they're there, they're living in it? Does that cover, or is that going to be a challengeable issue?
So we have had a lot of discussion on that particular topic and spoke to many other agencies. And the way most agencies are addressing that issue, whether we come upon what we would now call an abandoned vehicle or a stored vehicle, then we would treat it, and this is our current plan, subject to change, but we would treat it as a camping situation, whereby instead of giving 24 hours, we would then give 72 hours like a camping situation. So this would then require the officers to post notice on the vehicle as though it was a tent, and then provide the 72 hours. And this also requires, and we would want to do this anyway, that we notify our social service partners and make sure that we can find alternative locations for individuals in these vehicles.
Chief Spalding, I want to make sure we're also clear for everyone, because I know we get a lot of questions from the public about 72 hours. The 72-hour posting requirement for, you said like for tents, that is a state statute, correct?
That is a new ordinance. It used to be 24 hours. House Bill 2124, I believe it is, in the 2021 session, changed that to 72 hours for tents and camping. This is did that answer your question, Brett?
Yes, I just want to make sure when we're talking about a 72-hour requirement. I know we get a lot of questions from the public about why can't, I know we'll get more into the camping provisions at our next agenda item, but since you're referencing it for a time period, I wanted to make sure that was clear now.
Right. And again, our intent is not to displace people, but we do feel that we need to address the complaints that we do receive from our community about vehicles that are either hazards, blocking roadways, and address some of the other things where they're not even legal to be on the roadway, such as unlicensed, unregistered, and again, some of the other conditions I mentioned, such as environmental hazards, are clearly not even drivable.
So I just wanted to, so we'll get into this when we get into the camping and talking about where to locate. This would be part of that discussion where these RVs could go. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. We haven't got to that place yet where the RVs could go. That would be probably a whole separate conversation. I do know that, for example, Seaside has identified an area where they direct their vehicles that they can go to. Basically, it's a piece of city property that's an overflow parking lot that they generally use in the summer. That they are having issues with, because they're also finding this for every RV that is temporarily stored there, there's also 1 or 2 additional vehicles with each one, and it's become somewhat of a challenge. And then there's questions in terms of to what extent does the city have to provide additional services such as porta potties and showers, and maybe even provide some sense of security for those locations. And so that brings its own set of challenges, and we have not identified the recreational vehicles, or at least to have talked about a location where the recreational vehicles could go at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So one of the other, again, to address the issue that we've had in the past, for lack of a better term, to play games when we mark a vehicle and someone locates the vehicle to another location. Several agencies have used language that basically states that if there's currently a violation on the vehicle, doesn't have registration, doesn't have license plates, and some of the other things I mentioned, if the vehicle moves to another location in the city, it's still an ongoing occurring violation. And it's not a defense. The person simply relocates the vehicle, that they're no longer in violation of whatever the ordinance is that we've identified, and that vehicle could still be towed. And then we've also potentially are looking at language that would make it more, give everybody an opportunity to find another location in a lawful place, which is the 3 strikes, which would allow up to 3 times in 1 year before the vehicle would actually be towed. So they'd be marked, if they're marked twice, the 3rd time would be towed. So it's a little bit more grace period than simply towing after the first offense. So this would be provisions that, we would appreciate to hear from council on, whether that's something that council would like to see if we bring this ordinance forward and council considers it. So I'm going to, at this point, ask Sergeant Randall or Deputy Chief Halverson if there's anything else. I know there's a lot of pieces to this particular ordinance. We've already drafted our first draft of this. We are waiting for some additional legal review, and we would like to be bringing this forward at a future meeting, potentially as soon as next Monday, but in all likelihood, it might be the council meeting after that. So either Sergeant Randall or Deputy Chief Halverson, is anything that you would like to highlight out of this proposed language that I'm missing? I did kind of a higher level overview versus going through the proposed ordinance line by line.
Not for me, Chief.
Okay.
No, Chief, I don't have anything further.
Okay. So council, before I move into the camping section, I'd appreciate any comments or thoughts that you might have on this particular ordinance, and if you believe that this helps address some of the concerns that you hear from constituents in the community, and what obviously we hear as well.
For my part, I would like our ordinance to be as, I'll say strict, if that's the right word, as strict as possible regarding these vehicles. And, you know, it is a relatively small number of vehicles, but they have caused significant concern from the community, concern from me personally. A number of these vehicles it's not just that they are left in state of disrepair, but in the case of those that are lived in, this again, relatively small number of vehicles choose to be extremely disrespectful to the community by leaving trash and garbage strewn about outside of their vehicle, making no effort to clean it up. And I've confronted several of these vehicle owners personally with hefty bags, and asked them to clean up. And in some cases, they make a slight effort, but it doesn't last long. And you know, I think it's the combination of the vehicles and the disrespect of the vehicle owners by leaving trash strewn about, and particularly in highly visible places like at the 6th Street River Trail intersection, where at least 3 or 4 vehicles that I know of have repeatedly had their vehicles there. And so that the first thing that visitors to our community see on the river trail is garbage strewn about an abandoned vehicle with people there that are perfectly capable of cleaning it up and just choose not to. So I would like the ordinance to be as strict as it can be within whatever our legal limits are.
Thank you, Mayor.
I support the ordinance. I know we will be criticized most likely for being uncompassionate, but I personally believe people should be held to a basic standard of decency, which, as the mayor just pointed out, includes picking up trash and not threatening others, which I've heard has happened. And I know the police are well aware of this, as is probably everyone on the council. But for example, there is one RV that parks in a very conspicuous place, not right downtown, but just east of there. And I'm being deliberately vague, but this abandoned RV, well, it's not abandoned because somebody is living in it, or at least is occupying it, has been videotaped on social media frequently, with people coming and going on a regular basis, more regular than what you would expect to see from somebody simply living in a vehicle. So the implication being that the person is selling drugs. So something like that, we should have absolutely no tolerance for. I know the police do everything they can. So whatever we can do to get rid of this unlawful behavior and disrespectful behavior, I support.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Chief, for your due diligence and work on this. I think abandoned vehicles are one thing, but registration, license, and insurance are required of all motor vehicles, whether they're a recreational vehicle, car, motorcycle, or whatever. And those are not tents. Vehicles are not tents. 24-hour notice, making sure there's a sticker on the vehicle. Currently, there is 2 recreational vehicles parked between 16th and 17th on Duane, right behind the armory. And I can see visibly that those orange stickers are both posted on those vehicles. Propane bottles outside, garbage, the typical nuisance of what's going on. When there are camping areas for them to go and park and camp, they might not be in the city of Astoria, but they're in our outlying areas, whether they're a county park or a KOA or wherever they are. I think we as a city should not be supplementing their right to park their vehicle on our streets when our citizens want to either park their own recreational vehicle in front of their home and we're enforcing rules upon them. So we shouldn't be supplementing people that just want to come here in our community and camp and move their vehicles around, especially that one motorhome my colleague is referring to. That motorhome has its ability to move from location to location and often behind Safeway or by the swimming pool. And that's not just for us as citizens, but also for our children and those in which we protect. So I think, Chief, you have done a great job and you have a lot of work to do yet. I think that these laws speak clearly, and I think that the Corvallis guide to sleeping areas is well put out and thought out. So I think we really need to, we're not saying that we're not being polite or kind or that we don't care. We're saying that laws are made and they're made to be enforced. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you, Council. Thank you, Mayor. I would like to add that there's also a provision in this ordinance that if the vehicle is registered, parked in front of a residence that's currently registered at, there would be an additional provision to allow up to 72 hours. So it doesn't penalize somebody that is readying their motorhome for a trip or returning from a trip. So, we're trying to ensure that we, include every possible challenge, again, just by researching what other cities have done. The last thing I'd like to say on this piece too is that I don't know of an officerness agency that doesn't at least, look at every possible angle to be compassionate with somebody in the vehicle. And again, even though it's a requirement that we notify social services, that is what we do anyway. And, we're not looking to displace somebody, but we also understand that for all the reasons I've already mentioned, that there are needs sometimes from our community to move these vehicles on, and these will give us the tools to do that.
Thank you, Chief Spalding.
Okay, moving on. So on the topic of the camping ordinance discussion, so just as a reminder, we currently have language that addresses unlawful camping in the community. Since that time, though, as we all know, some of the challenges that we're all facing are some recent court decisions, recent legislation, and our own local ordinances. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those simply just to provide context, because it is important as part of the discussion and why we're even having the discussion today on potential locations. So again, I'm definitely not a legal expert, and read all of the court decisions and the recent legislation from the 2021 legislative session. I'm confused, as many people are, but there are some clearly common themes in these, and I will speak to those, and then in terms of how they apply to what we're trying to do today. So the two court decisions, again, I know you've all heard these, and I don't plan to go into any great level of detail, but of course the key case is the Martin versus Boise. So this was a Ninth Circuit court decision, which of course applies to Oregon, as with 7 other Western states, and of course Hawaii and Alaska. So it's the biggest circuit of all the 9 circuits. And I'm also read that 2/3 of the homeless population in the United States resides in the 9th Circuit. So it is very impactful. Basically, what this court decision relies on is the 8th Amendment, which is the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And basically, they're saying that it's not fair to punish somebody for their status of being homeless simply because they sleep outside when they may not have somewhere to go. There was a lot of different issues with Boise, because Boise actually did have available space, but the available space had certain restrictions, such as religious requirements for some of them. Some of them had certain hours that were restrictive, and some of them had certain behavior requirements and what have you. So there was different requirements, but basically that particular case said that you can't criminalize the status of homelessness, and that basically said that we cannot arrest somebody and take someone into jail for to treat it as criminalizing homelessness. So That really didn't have that much significant implication to us because we didn't have the ability to arrest somebody for camping anyway. And in the vast majority of cases, we wouldn't do that. We would issue a citation in situations where they're violating our local ordinance, and our citations were considered violation level offenses. So it would not be criminalizing the homelessness. Again, this is a Ninth Circuit decision, applies to multiple states. Blake versus Grants Pass was a decision that was filed about 40 days after the Blake decision or the Martin decision. And this is actually a district court decision, but it does apply to all of Oregon. So it does apply to us as well. So in the Blake's versus Grants Pass, this one took it a step further, and it said that local laws, that governments may enact local laws that prohibit individuals from sitting, lying, or sleeping on public property when there's no alternative locations available. It also referenced the Eighth Amendment and the right to be free from unreasonable, cruel, unusual punishment. And they took it a step further and said that we can't even issue a citation, which would have a fine attached, because homeless people don't have the ability to pay any fine. And so therefore that would be cruel and unusual. But what was important in this one is that as an alternative, if a city doesn't have ample shelter space, which both of these court decisions relied on, said if you don't have ample space where somebody can go to, then you can't criminalize the act of being homeless, because they don't have the ability to go somewhere else, and therefore you can't issue a citation for them simply sleeping or camping on public property. So the alternative was, if cities identified in an ordinance the reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, then you can enforce camping in other locations. So this basically, well, let me go to the next ordinance here, and then we can, or the next law, and then I can come back to this. So after these two court decisions, so House Bill 3115, again, this passed in the 2021 legislature, but it actually gave cities until July 1st of 2023 to amend their ordinances to be in compliance with this particular law. So this law was actually designed to codify the Martin versus Boise decision, knowing also that the Martin versus Boise decision will probably be challenged to the Supreme Court at some point, and therefore this will remain law even if that is overturned. So this particular case is the one that, again, requires cities to, if they don't want to enforce the camping laws in certain locations, they must have an ordinance that tells somebody where they can go. And so in our particular case, this would require us to note that either we have one location that would accommodate the individuals, or we would have to identify several locations where somebody could be accommodated. And it has to be, the language says it has to be objectively reasonable as to the time, place, and manner, although it doesn't necessarily give examples or identify or actually define what objectively reasonable necessarily means. I think we can all probably apply our own definition and come up with something that we think would apply. However, there is some ambiguity built into this. House Bill 3124, this is the one that increased the notice time from 24 hours to 72 hours. And it also placed some more restrictions in terms of handling of an individual's property if it's collected from a campsite. And that's the one where it needs to be stored for 30 days. So currently we have a current slate of ordinances, as I mentioned before, but if we move forward on this, these would be amended. So basically what this boils down to are, what do we do? What can we do? And what are our options to address these in order for us to be able to enforce unlawful camping? In other words, if someone sets up a tent in Heritage Square, technically, in order for us to enforce the camping ordinance, then we have to be able to tell somebody where they can go. So option number one is simply do not enforce camping or sleeping ordinances. Option number 2 is to be able to provide adequate shelter space for housing individuals in our community. And then the last one is to amend ordinances to address the time, place, and manner. I don't think that anybody would support simply not enforcing the laws. I think as far as providing adequate shelter space, I think this would be difficult to do, especially in any immediate manner. And so therefore, I think we're down to amending our current ordinance to address the time, place, and manner. I think it's important when we talk about some of the ordinances do address, or some of the case decisions actually talk about ensuring that you have adequate space or shelter space to house all your homeless population that's in your community. And so looking at the point in time count from 2020, there was identified as 1,189 individuals just in Clatsop County. And it doesn't break it down by city, but at least by zip code, there was 714 individuals in our 97103 zip code. There was no point in time count done in 2021 due to COVID. There was a point in time count done in 2022, just in January. However, they have not released the results yet. I'm told that they actually may see a decrease, but this is more because some agencies chose not to participate, including the schools, and also that some of the homeless refused to participate in the survey. So it may be less, but I don't know what those numbers are. So based off of this, I honestly can't say what the population is in our city, but this would be the best reference. It would be somewhat less than the 714, I would trust. But in order for us to build shelters that would house 714 people, I'm not sure that's something that's going to happen anytime soon. So staff met on several occasions and went through the map of the city to look at potential locations where we can tell people that they can go. Again, one option is to identify one large location where you could either have some form of either tiny homes or some other kind of a structure type thing, or even where people could set up tents, and then the city would have to provide certain services such as porta potties. Potentially, there's even some suggestion that might include showers, and as I mentioned before, even security. Alternatively, if we identify certain places within our community that people can go, then we have an ability to say that anything other than those locations is off limits and you cannot camp or sleep in those locations. Again, this when we speak about the time, place, and manner, this is the place portion of the time, place, manner. So the time, we could designate certain time. Most cities have chosen something like, some of them go dusk to dawn, some of them go 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And that's where somebody can sleep or camp in a particular location on public property, and they have to be out by a certain time in the morning. We do feel this will be a challenge to enforce because we don't have the adequate resources to be able to go around to every location and ensure that people are out by a certain time, especially if it's an area that might have a business use during the daytime. However, with that being said, we looked at possible areas throughout the city that could be used, albeit none of them in and of themselves would be an ample site for any particular location to be used by itself. So it'd have to be something where multiple sites would be identified. The list was based on the fact that it is either owned by the city or it's public property. We also, I will show you a separate list that, or at least a separate map that will identify what some cities have done, and that's where they reached out to their local churches, and churches that have parking lots have opened up their lots to allow camping in those situations. So I'll show you a separate map. We have not taken that step to contact any of the churches yet. We don't know if there's going to be interest. However, it's just to explore that as a possible option since other cities have done that. So looking at the map, I know this may be a little difficult to see, but basically a GIS map. So this is the possible locations based on the previous chart I showed you. All the little blue dots are the different locations. So this would provide locations pretty well spread out throughout the city. Both of the case law decisions addressed the fact that the locations have to be, generally speaking, within the city limits. In Grants Pass, they had a place right outside the city limits, and that was found to be unreasonable. And so that is definitely a consideration. In other words, we would probably have a hard time directing somebody to maybe even the fairgrounds would probably not be a reasonable location, even if the county was interested in doing that. So that's something we have to be cognizant of.
Chief Spalding, I want to make sure that that is very clear. Because I know, I just got a question even this morning about this issue. Can't Clatsop County develop a location to have a type of facility like this for all residents in Clatsop County? And just to reiterate that per our understanding, the answer is no, that each jurisdiction, each city is going to have to do something like this similarly. I know that Seaside's having conversations like this now. We are as well. But a shared location across all of Clatsop County would not be considered in line with the case law. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. Again, I think it does come back to what is objectively reasonable. It seems to me that for the benefit of some cities, there could be locations that could be an adjacent city that could be closer than an opposite side of their own city. So it would make sense to me that, if it's a smaller city and it's still within a reasonable distance, but there is nothing that defines that. There's nothing I've seen that talks about, blocks or miles or any sort of distance. It seems to refer to the city's borders. So these are, again, the locations that are on the list. The next slide is just showing what this could look like if all of the churches had interest in opening up their parking lots. Again, we would specify the time and the place. And so it would be certain hours, during, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., for example. So it wouldn't interfere with, in theory, with daytime business.
Just a quick question, Chief, about churches opening their parking lots. If the church is within a residential neighborhood, single-family homes, would they be required or would the city be required to allow that if a church wanted to do that? Even though I can imagine residents would not want that.
I suspect that of all the sites that we're mentioning, whether it's churches or their locations, many of them are within residential neighborhoods. I suspect that there will be pushback from every location on both maps.
True.
As far as requiring if we allowed that use on the church parking lots, I would defer to Brett for an answer on that question. I don't know. I wouldn't believe the city would require any church. Well, we wouldn't require anybody to use their private property for this purpose. This would be on a volunteer basis. So it'd be more.
But if the church wanted,
yeah.
If the church wanted to, though.
Sure.
There is, I believe, Chief, embedded in some of the legislation, some guidance dealing with this issue. I can't remember which one of the House bills it was, but I know like some other cities in Oregon have allowed through their own ordinance process a certain number of perhaps parking spaces in church parking lots that can be used for car camping, or to be able to limit the impacts to the neighborhood. But that's something that we've seen that some jurisdictions have allowed 2 or 3 cars to park in church parking lots. What's interesting about Astoria is so many of the churches were built before cars that many of the churches don't have parking lots. But that would have to be explored more in detail. But we wanted to at least put that out there as it has been a tool which has been used by other communities.
Thank you.
The next document I'll share, then I'll come back to the PowerPoint slide. And this is the exercise that we went through with staff in order to try to identify these locations. And as soon as I can figure out the sharing thing again, I will share it. Let's see here. No. Okay, here we go. So staff went through and just looked at a map and looked at locations, again, most cases that were public property that could be an area that wouldn't necessarily be used in the nighttime, would have hopefully minimal impacts. And then we went through and looked at, what are the pros and what are the cons. Many of these had similar cons as far as too far from services, close to a high school, for example. There was a concern about, being in a potentially close to a residential area, right next to a bank, for example. So we went through and looked at all the different, what we felt were the pros and cons for every one of these locations, and identified those in this list. And so this list was used to develop the two maps that I just shared with you, and then the list that was included as part of the PowerPoint presentation. So in terms of moving forward, we felt that at the direction of the mayor and council, whether this is going to be something that would be discussed in more detail today or at a future meeting, but we at least wanted to introduce that some work has been done on this. So it may not be all inclusive, but we feel we've covered many of the locations throughout the city. And Brett, I'll defer to you at this point before I move back to their slide in terms of moving forward in the presentation.
Sure. I want to point out that when staff went through this exercise, there are not locations that are ideal anywhere in the community. That's why we had to come up with pros and cons. And these are just pros and cons that were developed by staff, and there may be additional pros and cons that the council or the community may have to say on some of these. But it was trying to identify possible locations that we could be focusing on. We don't have an area that's fairly vacant, that is close to all the various services, that has unintended consequences or effects on adjacent properties. So I just want to make that statement that this is just an exercise that we went through, not saying these are all recommended, but we're providing ideas for dialogue and discussion.
Well, I'll jump in first. And thanks for the list and the pros and cons and the analysis. And I think this is really an important topic to present to the community, because the community does not want people camping throughout the city. They don't want tents up on the river trail. They don't want tents up at the Boyington building. They don't want tents up at the Garden of Surging Waves. And it's important to be very upfront with the community members that the choices are either that camping that takes place now continues in much the same way, or we identify one or more of these public areas as designated campsites, and they will have a lot of people camping there. And the people in the neighborhoods where these locations are not going to like it either. And so we don't have a choice between a good solution that everyone loves and the current state. It's the community is going to need to provide input on what it considers the lesser of two evils, to have a couple of large concentrated campsites in town, or to have continued dispersed camping on various public areas that could change from day to day, depending on where people want to put their tent up. And those are kind of the choices that we have right now. And so what I would envision is not that that this comes to the city council meeting for a vote at the next meeting, but that rather there's an opportunity, whether it's through an open house, whether it's through just a couple of public meetings where we invite the public to comment, or whether it's something on our website that people can submit input. But I think it's very important that we gather public input on do they want to have designated sites so that we can reduce the sort of just random camping all over town. And if they do want to have designated sites, what are the sites that are seem to be least objectionable to the public? And maybe a couple of additional pros and cons. I'm sure all my colleagues could come up with other pros and cons. Personally, I don't think I would want a large campsite to be right on Highway 30, where people coming in and out of town, that's the first thing they see when they come into Astoria. Something that starts to look like Portland potentially. I think it's going to be challenging to have them, smack dab in a residential neighborhood, although in almost every case there will be residential units near any of these facilities. I would like to absolutely reach out to the faith community and see if there are any of the buildings in the faith community that are interested in offering any of their property for this. I would like also to look at the possibility of privately owned property, and whether there are any private property owners, if there's any property that might be suitable, but it's not public property now, if any of the private property owners might be interested in making that property available. And perhaps there's some funding through either the county or the state to acquire or lease property. I think the Pacific Power property on the South Slope, that's considered commercial property, right? It's not public property. It's owned by Pacific Power. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And are there any other commercial properties? Or is that the only commercial?
Say that, Mayor, I want to first of all say that property right there, we don't even know if that's even a possibility, because there was an environmental cleanup on that site from the former gasification plant site. And
Right.
I've haven't been able to talk to Lisa Dunlap at Pacific Power, even to understand if that's even a possibility under the environmental cleanup provisions that are in place on that site.
Right.
But it was one that was just identified at that location. Mayor, I would like to also note that that our Community Development Director, Meg Leatherman, had just let me know that it's House Bill 2006, which allows the city to allow overnight camping on church parking lots, and allows the city to impose reasonable conditions, including a maximum number of individuals who could camp there. They're required to provide toilets, water, and trash collection. But it also added that the House bill also added private property owners to be able to have the same ability, and the city could pass laws for that type of use on private property.
Okay. And I think, an additional consideration is, quite frankly, do we want to site an encampment in a location that is primarily cited as most conducive to the comfort and of the persons who are going to be camping there, which makes it more attractive for other people to come into our community because it's such a great campsite, as opposed to making it further away. For instance, say you have one of the sites on the picture there is at Warren Field, and as you indicated, of course, that's jointly owned with the school district, and the school district would have to support that as well. And I don't know if that would ultimately happen, but a site like that's further away removes what would be some of the objections in the community to an encampment anywhere, which is that being highly visible, and highly visible to tourists that are visiting our community, and highly visible to residents. having it be farther away at a place like Warren Field would be more favorable for people with those concerns. And might make it less of an attractant for people to come from other communities. And as we've seen from the statistics, we do have the highest number. First of all, Clatsop County has the highest number of unhoused people in the state. And then within the county, the city of Astoria has I'm assuming the highest number, maybe next to Warrenton would be next. I know that Chief Spalding recently talked to the police chief at Cannon Beach, who indicated you probably could count on one hand the number of unhoused people down there, because down there are no services whatsoever. And that is a factor in where unhoused folks do congregate. So I think there's a lot of discussion to be had, and certainly we are going to want some community input on this as well. I'll shut up now.
Mayor, I would like to add, that when we propose the option of identifying locations where people could stay, and then anywhere else that isn't identified would be an area that they couldn't stay. We understand that some agencies have actually looked at identifying certain locations that you definitely can't be on, and then everywhere else that's public property you can be. We felt this was really untenable in terms of really trying to enforce, because that would mean that people could then set up a camp on a sidewalk, anywhere in the downtown for that matter, any other public property, any other parking lot. And that would be, again, we felt much more problematic and very difficult, if not impossible, for us to deal with. But just wanted to make council aware that that is one approach, not necessarily, at least from our opinion, the best one.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. And I was actually going to suggest that, given that I'm going to guess it's going to take us a while to select some sites that we are going to direct people to, that in the interim, if it were possible to prohibit camping outright from just a couple of places like the Garden of Surging Waves that are most highly visible, I would like to do that. But if you feel it's not practical, then that's a consideration as well.
Yeah, and one other thing I would like to clarify too is that amongst the different court decisions and the House bill is that there is a distinction between sleeping and camping. And so this also gets to the last piece when I talk about the time, place, and manner. There's the manner. The manner piece is the part that, again, is not 100% clear, but basically that's the manner in which you can sleep. And that would be, are you permitted to have a bedroll? Are you permitted to have a sleeping bag? Or would it be a tent? It's pretty clear that you can't set up any sense of a permanent structure, especially when you're identifying only certain hours that you can actually be there. It does talk about, again, the objective reasonableness piece. And some cities that we've talked to only permit a sleeping bag or a bedroll. I suspect they may have a little bit less rainfall than we do, and that might be a more difficult hurdle as far as being reasonable for a place like Astoria that has 78 plus inches of rain a year. You might be able to identify based on impending weather, whether or not people could set up a tent, but they do make a distinction with camping and actually enforcing camping laws against the individual. So we do still have ability to address some of the structures of the tents, and a little bit of a gray area, but we're trying to seek clarity in that area as well. So that would be the other piece that the ordinance would have to identify as the manner, and what that looks like for this community may be different than it looks like for Medford, who does not permit tents. So just one more piece of this.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Estes, if I can ask you, so I note that the warming center put out a notice last night that it was the last night of the 90 days they're allowed every year.
Right.
And so can you remind us what currently restricts the warming center to 90 days a year? And if the warming center were allowed to be open year round, presumably if they have 28 beds, whatever the number is now, that's 28 people that would not be camping on our public property, but would be in a shelter.
Sure. So, so the warming center was first able to locate in the fellowship hall of First Methodist Church under an allowance made by the state fire marshal that said that occupancy spaces like church fellowship halls can be used for a 90-day period for an emergency shelter without having to upgrade the building to comply with building codes. So that's, for instance, that fellowship hall does not comply with state building codes for sleeping areas because the state fire marshal has allowed them to operate for a period of not more than 90 days. Now, let's say the Warming Center and First Methodist Church decided to invest in the upgrades, sprinkler system, alarm systems, those types of things. Then they would be allowed to have more time throughout the year for sleeping in that facility. I do want to talk about some legislation that went into effect a couple of years ago, because at one point in time, we had yearly conditional use permits. We call them temporary use permits, where the Warming Center would apply for a temporary use permit to operate for the next year. The first set of temporary use permits was approved after mediation sponsored by the city between the neighborhood and the Warming Center. We hired a mediator to mediate between those parties. They came up with a good neighbor agreement is what happened through that mediation process. And every year, the good neighbor agreement would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. A couple of years ago, the legislature allowed for the state of Oregon legislature allowed for emergency shelters to go into place and removed local jurisdictions' ability to zone them or deal with conditional use permits. That was a temporary measure, and that temporary measure expired in July of this last year. However, in working with our city attorney, the law was written to give those temporary shelters in place enough time for their use to be vested without the city to continue to come back and regulate them through zoning. So the Warming Center, because the legislature said we couldn't require conditional use permits any longer, they went through a long enough of a period where their use is vested from a zoning standpoint without having to come back for yearly permits. That being said, they could expand the time that they serve their clients if they upgraded the building to comply with state building codes. As a follow-up to that, recently we had some discussion with the city attorney about could the city council now pass zoning laws which state where emergency shelters could be permitted in the city. And based upon his review of the state legislation, the city attorney has said that should the council wish to address this issue, to say where emergency shelters could be permitted in the future, we could do that now that that time frame has passed. That you could look and say, in what zoning districts do you want or do you not want emergency shelters to be located? So that's something you could consider now.
Okay, thank you.
So for Chief Halverson or Sergeant Randall, anything else that I've missed on the camping piece before we press on?
Not for me, Chief.
No, Chief, other than to say that McMinnville has a pretty good example of an ordinance that deals with religious locations for camping and for private use of private property owners that has a permitting process through the city, which we could look at including with 4 places for people to go.
I do have one question. I'm sorry, I do have one question regarding camping and reading the Corvallis ordinance that the city manager sent us. According to that ordinance, if I read it correctly, Martin v. Boise does still allow communities to prohibit camping on sidewalks within 50 feet of a trail, which I would assume could mean the River Walk, as well as 50 feet, within 50 feet of a sidewalk. So I'm wondering, that made me wonder how wide the Garden of Surging Waves is, but I might have misread that.
No, Counselor, you are correct. And part of that speaks to when we talk about the time, place, manner. Again, that would be the place and the manner in which you do it. And I think that's where they've been able to be a little bit more specific as far as certain locations within certain areas. So we still can explore that possibility to identify places that people can camp, cannot camp, and then everywhere else that's public property. I think that would take a little bit bigger exercise and maybe some unintended consequences. But we could, as part of our list of places that people can go, get more specific and where it would have to be. And some of the cities have even used things where there has to be a certain distance between encampments, certain distance from schools, certain distance from utilities, and different things like that, that there are certain requirements that are even built into the locations.
Thank you.
They're looking for comment at this point, but I would just say I really appreciate all the work and the thought and the consideration that has gone into what we've seen so far. It's such a complicated problem, and it's good to be able to distinguish between people like the mayor described, who make a mess and then basically flip you off when you ask them to clean it up, and other people who are really just hanging on by a thread. And so we're looking for solutions that give some leverage against the former without further punishing the latter. In terms of the campsites that we just zip through, if it's possible and safe, I think the Pacific Power property has appeal in a number of ways. One, it is really large, and so it could conceivably be the site, at least for a while. Having a site enables you to do some things you can't do on scattered sites. One of them would be to have it staffed, perhaps through one or more of our social service agencies. And I think people in the community might be very willing to help fund those agencies for additional staffing because of the benefit it would bring the community. If they were staffed both for safety and for assistance, also would enable us to have some things like porta potties and trash pickup and so on, which would make that possible. Fitting in with all the other things you're describing. So, I think there's some benefit to things like that, and as we go forward. Hopefully we can move in a direction like that. It just seems like having a number of sites in different places would be sort of crazy making for the police department, for one thing, trying to monitor all that and answer issues at each of those places. But that's my 2 cents for now. Anyway, I appreciate the work on this. It's a complicated problem dealing with human beings, and I like what you've done.
I agree. The city is between a rock and a hard place, and we do need to designate an authorized camping site. I also foresee this costing the city a decent amount of money, because we can't just have a site designated without providing porta potties, an adequate number, without providing regular garbage service, possibly other sanitary services, whatever that might be. So that is a concern of mine. I know this is going to cost money. Maybe we can get help from some of the social service agencies. And this may help the police, but it also may just centralize where some of the issues are occurring, because reading about the problems associated with the designated camping site in Seaside, I know it hasn't been easy for the city down there. And then my question is, if we do designate a site, and the Pacific Power site was the first one that jumped out to me as being probably the most appropriate, but who knows? If we do designate a site, does it have to be large enough to accommodate those estimated 700 homeless people? Just to put that in perspective, Fort Stevens, which at one time, and it may still be, was the largest state park campground in the state of Oregon, with just over 600 camping spots. So I just don't think it's reasonable for the city to have to accommodate all 700 homeless individuals with a camping spot, but maybe that's not the way, maybe that's not required.
So Counselor,
Yeah.
I'm respond to a couple of your points. First of all, there's a part of the presentation you haven't seen yet, which deals with some financial implications.
Okay.
Budget season. And we have items that we want to touch on that's even beyond talking about the issue of providing porta potties and other services. We have some other issues that the chief will be talking about that's based upon legislation of how we deal with storage and recording camped items. And we're going to be needing to deal with that in this next budget. And so you're going to be seeing some items, and we're going to have to determine how that affects our whole general fund budget this next fiscal year. But there is going to need to be some funds dedicated towards this, and Chief Spalding will be talking about that in a minute. I do want to note with the Pacific Power site, in addition to the, it was identified because it is a flat site, and there's some characteristics which made it as a possibility, but the other items that I said before, the challenges dealing with it being a formerly contaminated site, as well as its proximity to utility infrastructure. I know that Pacific Power will want to make sure that is addressed, because it is a major substation for the city where you have a lot of need to access that property whenever there are outages. And so there are some other things that I know that will need to be looked into as a part of that site as well. So I'll turn it back. I don't know if Mayor, if you're wanting all the councilors to give some comments, because there is more to come.
That's if any other councilors want to comment right now, otherwise we'll continue on.
Yeah, since we're working on possible site locations, and one thing the city manager mentioned was that the county is leaving it up to our jurisdiction, or each city's jurisdiction. Well, the county has a lot of property in the city of Astoria. And so we need to see, I guess I would ask, have we approached them to make them an active participant in the solutions of this issue? And also, I'd also say the Port of Astoria. The Port of Astoria has a lot of available land that could be used as if you look behind Pier 3 in the boatyard, those could be possible site locations if other members of our community want to become active. And that would also require changing in the code and campsite use and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we have reached out to Clatsop County and had conversations with their management team about locations. Chief Spalding, did we have the location over at 8th and Duane as a location?
Let's see here.
We'd had some conversations about, and feedback we got from Clatsop County is, first of all, around the courthouse, they're having to address some of the issues dealing with court proceedings and dealing with some camping around the courthouse whenever you're in a certain proximity to having court proceedings. But there has been some conversation about the possibility of the former Derelict building site that was torn down several years ago, where the county commission was wanting to have a clinic built there. The problem with that site for them is that that's where they park all of their vehicles right now. But, you know, in terms of properties inside the city limits, you know, most of theirs are the governmental buildings, you know, downtown. The only one which is really kind of vacant at this point in time is that former Derelict site where they park their county rigs during the day.
There's also the site right across from the Baptist church. That's a parking lot also that they, I believe, is owned by the county also.
Baptist Church.
Uh,
The parking lot. I mean,
at 7th and Commercial Street.
over there. Yeah, I mean, it's, we've had conversations with them, and it's, I mean, those are other locations that are possibilities. You know, again, it was a conversation about what is potentially doable inside the city of Astoria. Only brief conversations with Will Isom over at the port. However, the port, you know, is looking for ways to be able to, you know, redevelop their sites to be able to become financially supportive. But, you know, there's been a brief conversation with the port director, Will Isom, about this conversation we're having today.
Thank you.
So I would like to address one piece of Councilor Herman's question. And this is out of one assessment here. And basically what they're saying is the Martin case forbids cities from enforcing common sense ordinances that prohibit public camping unless the city can offer acceptable shelter to every unhoused person in the jurisdiction. They also use the analogy of city of Los Angeles, for example, who have an estimated 60,000 homeless people. And for the city of Los Angeles to provide housing for 60,000 people, not only would cost billions, but there's clearly that just isn't going to happen. So it makes it somewhat unrealistic to even comply with that part of the ordinance. With that being said, you know, in my discussions with one of the attorneys from CIS, we talked about more on an individual basis. If we had a shelter and we encountered an individual, we could conceivably call the shelter and determine that there is an open bed and that they would be willing to take this person, you know, if they're not a high barrier shelter and otherwise qualify, then we would be okay to direct the person to that shelter. But anyway, it gets somewhat complicated, and that hopefully answers your question.
And I'd just add in response to Councilor Herman too, when we look at these homeless count numbers, that's not people on the street. That's people who are also, you know, couch surfing. They're sheltered in a variety of different ways, but are still houseless. So the number of people on the streets is probably significantly less than that 700 count. So I guess the question that comes out of that, you know, do we have numbers that might help reflect that? And is that indeed what we'd be looking for alternative camping sites to reflect what's actually on the street, not those houseless numbers, as Councilor Herman pointed out?
Yeah, I think that's worthy of exploration, Counselor. I know that there are two different definitions based on whether you're looking at the HUD numbers or if you're looking at the Department of Education, for example, where, you know, one of them does refer to houseless and the others are someone who's living in a cardboard box per se. So I do think that would be an important distinction. I don't know necessarily that the law makes that distinction, but I think that would speak to reasonableness. Okay, well, If no other questions on the camping portion, I'll move on. Of course, time for questions at the end as well.
Okay,
So one of the challenges that, and we decided that, you know, since we're on the topic, just to touch on a couple other things that we're dealing with, of course, is the increased amount of trash we're seeing in our community, and also the challenge of property storage. All of our departments are resource challenged, and whenever we do have a request to pick up trash, sometimes it can take days because there are other high priority items that different departments in the city are dealing with. I will give a big shout out to our Public Works and our Parks Department. I think they've done a great job in doing the work that they have done, and it's been a tremendous help. But there's more, I would say, trash and property out there than even we have the ability to deal with our current staffing. The city manager and several members of the department team met and considered different options, and in part based on what some other cities are doing, we learned that, you know, a bigger city like Boise, for example, and talking to them, they actually hire a contractor to come out, and they have a third-party company that has a location, and the property is taken to, they store it. The individual, when it's time to come collect the property, can go there within 30 days and get the property. So other than having somebody there when they bag and tag the property and take it away, it's kind of hands off. They have told us that they're potentially in danger of losing that contract because they've had several confrontations with individuals coming when they come to pick up their property. So that may not last for long. So we discussed this morning, and realizing that the current market out there for third-party vendors may be challenging, and we would probably be better to manage a position potentially in the city, maybe even for the Parks Department, that could be an additional resource to police some of the additional garbage that we're seeing in town, and also to assist with property storage that we collect either from abandoned encampments or just simply property that's abandoned in the downtown area and anywhere else for that matter. We do have to collect that property. Anything that's obvious trash, we have the ability to dispose of. Anything that is potentially has utility or value, whether it's wet or appears to us to be not in great shape, we are going to collect and err on the side of caution. And then there's certain items that are obviously either illegal to possess, needles, those kinds of things. Obviously, soiled clothing and something like that would be disposed of, but the rest of it would be collected and noted. The location, an individual would have the ability to come down and pick that up within the 30-day period. Again, there is a challenge to storage of the property. One of the options we talked about was to rent or purchase a Connex type container. And there's a couple areas in the city that we had explored that'd be a possible location we could store that and keep the property in it if we could find a way to ventilate it. So but these are some possible solutions. I can tell you just in the early formative stages, the one individual that if there was support through the budget process and move forward in that position would also potentially even be someone that could, pick some of the shopping carts up as well. So it could be part of what many cities are doing, looking at a bigger solution with what they call a community livability unit. And even though we're smaller than some of the agencies that have it, we feel that, combining, resources from the police department and other departments in the city, we could almost create something like that to address many of these issues. And Brett, I'm going to defer to you to talk about more of this.
So I do want to, talk about, items that the city has done over the past year to even start touching on some of these items. First of all, in the Parks Department, we added a full-time position this past year, which now deals with tourism-related sites and their cleanup. You may recall that we had for years used a contractor to clean restrooms. However, trying to find a contractor that would be willing to take that on was a challenge. And then the contractor who did make a bid, it became quite pricey to be able to engage on those services, to the point where we found it that we could pay for a full-time position to be there, to be on call, to respond to bathroom cleanups for our tourism facilities whenever they're on the job, to be responsible for cleaning up the parks, cleaning up the Riverwalk. And that individual works over the weekends, which is something which was really needed, especially during the pandemic, when we started having people having more to-go boxes. And we found our garbage cans overflowing on days when Recology, which services our garbage cans, was maybe not picking up. And we have someone who can go and lift that can and dump it during the weekend. What we're seeing is we'll get calls over the weekend where we'll hear of garbage that was produced adjacent to an abandoned vehicle and an RV along the Riverwalk. And our parks employee had just been there a few hours earlier. I can tell you, with my office at City Hall, I can look out in the morning and the parks crews are going and patrolling and cleaning up all of the Garden of Surging Waves. And 2 hours later, it can be a total mess. And it's just at a drop of a hat, the things can change. So we're talking about what can be done to be able to better be on some of these issues. And many times the sites that are being impacted are visitor-related properties, interestingly enough. But as the chief said, we've just started the conversation with how can we put something in the budget. It's not figured out yet. We are already working at the city council's direction to take the part-time community service officer position and upgrade it to a full-time position. And we're working to hopefully be able to get that job description to the city council at your next meeting, so we can start the hiring process to fill that. And again, this is a police department position that will be focused on these quality of life issues and be able to work with folks who may be dealing with some of the abandoned vehicles and some of the ordinances that the council is considering, that this will be a position just focused on these issues. They would be able to be working with Clatsop Behavioral Health, that they're looking to embed some of their staff in the police department, that this would be a direct connection. One of the other things, we had a conversation, I had a conversation last night with the ADHDA board, the Downtown Association board, and their community outreach officer position. That's the position that deals with parking downtown that we fund through our transient lodging taxes. And there's a vacancy right now, and they're needing to rehire for that position. And it's, as we all know, it's hard to find people to come to take part-time employment. And so we're going to be looking at what can the city do to be able to provide more resources to be able to get someone who could really be in that position to be a good partner who could maybe even help if they see issues downtown, to be communicating back to the police and to the park staff. So those are just some of the things that we're looking at right now, even going through the budget process. And we're going to have to see what we can do. And there may be some priorities that we're going to have to really focus on, and that all of these are, a lot of these items are general fund dollar items. But we're looking at what can be done with the Promote Astoria Fund and the transient lodging taxes as well. Mayor, that's all I've got.
That's what I was just going to ask you, that whether, for example, the funds that we give to the LCTC perhaps could be a source of some of this funding, since to a great extent what we're trying to do is make the community more livable and attractive, not just to residents, but for our visitors that contribute so much to the economy.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at the Promote Astoria funds as a possibility. but recall that we have a lot of grant applications that have been successful and that need some of those Promote Astoria funds as matches as well. And so we've been very lucky and we're very happy that we have received those grant applications, but they do require matches, some of which will come out of these the Promote Astoria Fund budget. So we're just going to be looking to see what we can do to be able to achieve all these goals through the budget process.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Brett. So again, just kind of recapping what we shared at the last work session. I don't plan to go into any great level of detail. Just to remind council that some of the things that we are working on, some of the things that we may be bringing back to council in the near future, so that we're looking at all of these different things in totality and taking a holistic approach to dealing with all of our challenges. And again, you know, doing this in a manner that still allows us to be compassionate, but also, you know, holding individuals accountable for bad behavior that is raising the ire of many in our community. So to that end, just a couple things as far as some additional tool options. You know, we're working, we're going to be hopefully having some meetings here soon with the courts and social service partners to look at some alternatives such as court diversion programs. One of the things the Martin versus, or the Blake versus Grants Pass case noted was that since you can't assess fines as cruel and unusual punishment, they suggest that you look at civil alternatives to civil dispositions and community community work and type things as an alternative disposition. So we're going to be, you know, working on that. We already talked before about the municipal court and dealing with violation level offenses. The chronic offender program is to address individuals that are on our radar more than they should be, and to find ways that we can reduce calls for service by addressing our top offenders in our community. And oftentimes that's through our partners with mental health issues, substance abuse, et cetera. Some of the other ordinance we're maybe bringing forward to council, depending on the council's level of interest. Some of these are probably less important, but we do get calls for aggressive panhandlers. Several cities have an aggressive panhandler ordinance, which, for example, like Wilsonville, that theirs does not restrict panhandling because we can't, but it does set restrictions as to where you can do it, such as you cannot do it within a certain distance of an ATM, no abusive language, and certain times you can't do it. And they've been successful with that. The unattended property on sidewalk ordinance, if someone just abandons property, obviously that would give us a little bit more ability to address it, and we would treat it like I've mentioned before, where it would be taken for a period of 30 days. So it could still be collected with no charge to the individual. The community resource officer position, which is the current placeholder title, if this is approved through council in the budget position, budget process. This is the individual that the city manager was talking about to address multiple issues. We do feel that this is a key position that's in order to bring many of these forward, we're going to need that additional resource, somebody that will concentrate on these and have a better ability to follow up, especially things that have certain time components to them, such as abandoned vehicles and camping issues. Next steps, you will be seeing next Monday night the return of the shopping cart ordinance and the camping ordinance, as the mayor mentioned. That'll probably be pushed out a little bit further. We have some additional work to do. We'll do some follow-up items in terms of contacting churches, private property owners, and then we do want to do some additional legal review on that, but we'd like to bring that forward sooner than later, so hopefully within next month. And then the other ones that we've talked about, and I know there's interest from council on, is the expulsion zone, looking at processing some of these violations more through our municipal court. I already mentioned aggressive panhandling, already mentioned the community resource officer position, and already talked about property storage. So with that being said, that concludes my presentation, and happy to take any questions.
Hey, Chief Spalding, can you go back to the prior slide?
I can.
So under the current proposing, one other item that may be coming forward is the abandoned vehicle ordinance as well?
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
you're right.
Yeah, okay.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
So on the, and you mentioned on a couple slides back, the frequent flyer issue and the expulsion zone issue. And I did want to bring up, it wasn't really on the agenda for today, but we talked about that that viral video from the most recent fight in front of the Lifeboat Services facility, which happened Monday night during the open house. And you had let me know that of 4 of the people involved in that fight, I think the lowest number of police contacts with one of them was 47, and the highest was someone who had over 225 contacts with the police. And so I wonder if you could just address, for the benefit of the public, how it happens that people who have been the subject of literally hundreds of police calls are still out on the streets. And is there anything we can do to get people, and again, it comes back to, all unhoused people end up getting a bad name because of the extremely bad behavior of really a relative handful. And what can we do to get that relative handful who occupy 90% of your time and who cause most of the public concern about homelessness because of their bad behavior to get them off the streets, if anything?
Right. Yeah, thank you, Mayor. In anticipation of your question, I actually reached out to Deputy Chief Halverson and asked him to reach out to our county partners. And he actually spoke with the jail commander and actually spoke with Sheriff Phillips. And I actually see that Sheriff Phillips happens to be on the call here to take some of our good ideas. But aside from that, I know that he would also be welcome to answer any questions regarding the jail. But I'm going to first turn it over to Deputy Chief Halverson and address some of the current challenges. However, the good news is that some of the current challenges are improving. And so in addition to the new jail next fall. So Chief Halverson, if you would touch on this piece of it, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. We do run into a lot of repeated offenders, many of which we do arrest and take to jail. And I'll let Sheriff Phillips speak to the capacity issues at the jail. Other ways that we're trying to address this is through our chronic offender program and trying to point people toward resources so that we can hopefully remove them from those situations. But a lot of that relies on them engaging in services, and some of them are not willing to engage in services. The ones that are, we're able to see some successes. But with regard to the jail housing issues, I'm going to turn it over to Sheriff Phillips to discuss that. I will say that a lot of the offenses that are problematic to the community, the disorderly conduct, those are lower level offenses. And so people typically do not remain in custody for, even though they've been arrested multiple times, they don't remain in custody for those lower level misdemeanor offenses. And then working it through the court process, of course, it takes longer than we would like. So Sheriff Phillips, are you on?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mayor Jones and councilors. To talk about the jail, I have to admit, it's been frustrating having a small jail in Clatsop County for many years. And certainly the pandemic has not been friendly to our ability to hold people, which would definitely benefit our community. During the pandemic, there was a variety of regulations that dictated how we were supposed to run our facility, dictated by both OSHA and OHA, Oregon Health Authority. And one of the biggest challenges we faced is the requirement to quarantine people coming into a congregate living facility, which is a jail. And the requirements were always that we were supposed to quarantine each new person for 14 days before we could house them in general population. We have limited options to house people in our current jail. So what we did is we set aside a 1 cell block that had individual lockdown cells so that people could be isolated from each other. for the quarantine period before, moving into general population. That allowed us to do 6 to 7 people at a time, and we found 14 days was not practical, and we thought we could maybe justify 10 days so we could try to introduce more people into the jail. So we took a risk by being outside of OSHA recommendation and shortened it. The good news is now we have an option to work with our local public health authority, and we are able to move that quarantine period down to 5 days with the ability to test out. We have a Abbott Rapid ID machine now, and so we should be able to slowly increase the number of people admitted to the jail. Basically, what it's come down to is a difficult decision on who we would have to release if we let someone in on a misdemeanor, disorderly conduct or something like that. The people currently housed in the jail are either sentenced or they're on pretrial status for very significant crimes. Almost all of them, serious person felonies. So I think it's in our best interest to keep those people in jail. And it's just a difficult choice to have to let others out. So, there is, good news on the horizon with the opening of the new jail. We anticipate will be in October. That will give us a significant added capacity, but the upcoming threat is Senate Bill 48, which we anticipate there will be a order from the Chief Justice that will limit who we can hold until arraignment. So the only people that we could hold overnight until arraignment at this point would be any violent felony, someone arrested on a Class A felony, a sex crime, domestic violence felony or misdemeanor, and any stalking order violation or restraining order violation. So basically what we're anticipating is that we will be ordered to conditionally release people that have stolen cars or simple assaults, maybe even a burglary. So there are challenges on the horizon.
Thank you, Sheriff. So is that a bill that's going to be coming forward, or is that just an agency decision that you anticipate being made?
This is Senate Bill 48, which goes into effect July 1st of this year. And like I say, we're waiting on a order from the Chief Justice. And what I just read you is what we have been provided by the Criminal Justice Commission to anticipate. There will be overriding circumstances that the local presiding judge can write into a general order. But like I say, I am expecting some challenges in holding people even overnight in the future, which I think is really unfortunate.
Yeah, that's extraordinarily disappointing. So would it take an actual piece of state legislation to be able to say that someone has had over 100 arrests in a 2-year period, even if it's all misdemeanors, that they could be held? Is that just something that's not?
Yeah, I think in that case that might qualify for an overriding circumstance. Statutorily, judges can decide to hold someone in custody to ensure court appearance, and more recently they can consider community safety.
Well, if there's any chance even one of our frequent flyers could be held under overriding circumstance, that would be great, but I'll leave it to you experts to determine if that's possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Mayor, a couple different components. The other side of the equation too, since there's multiple pieces to the criminal justice system, and even at the officer level, the officer does have discretion to issue a citation in the field, and I will share that oftentimes the officers feel frustrated because they really don't feel it's going to have much of an impact, and in part because they'll issue a citation and the likelihood of someone appearing is not very high. And if they don't, they're issued a warrant. Then if we come across them again, they can be taken to jail. And then again, oftentimes they'll be released on a citation for all the reasons that the sheriff mentioned. The other part of this is that there is some pushback from the court in terms of, and I believe it's based on capacity, but we've heard through the district attorney's office that there are certain low-level offenses that the court has pushed back on in terms of bringing forward simply because of capacity issues. So some of the lower level issues such as trespassing and some of the other things that we deal with, which are the quality of life crimes, which of course we get the vast majority of our calls on, are less of a priority to our courts, who really are dealing with some more serious matters. So just to paint the entire picture of all of the challenge we have in a smaller county with limited resources. So that is a challenge.
Thank you.
Sure. So aside from any questions too, I would appreciate any feedback from council in terms of if any of the things we've discussed outside of what we've already talked about bringing forward, such as the vehicle, recreational vehicle and derelict vehicle ordinance and the shopping cart, which is already on the agenda. We'd be interested to, and aside from the camping ordinance, be interested if there's anything that's, rises to the top of your list in terms of what you'd like to see from the city.
It sounds like nothing else nothing in addition to the things you've already listed. So, Mr. Estes, I know it's just a little after 3, but we did have some people on. I don't know how many people are in chambers or if anybody wants to speak. I did want to offer the opportunity to the folks on the Zoom call or in chambers who would like to make a brief comment to be able to either make a brief comment.
Sure. And so the folks that were here in council chambers have departed except for Geoff Harrington, our Public Works Director, so no other citizens in the council chambers. So I'll let you manage if you want to have anyone on the Zoom call be able to be opening it up.
Yeah, so anybody on the Zoom call, if you'd like to make public comment, if you just use the use that raised hand feature on your Zoom so that we can see you, and you'd be welcome to speak for up to 3 minutes.
I'm not seeing any raised hands at this point in time. Maybe Mayor, if you here we are. We have Nate Pinkstaff.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Pinkstaff.
I just had a question back to Mr. Estes about the beds. He was talking about, I think he said that there was 28 beds at the warming center, but due to the their 90 days was up. I was just curious if anybody's reached out to the county along with the city to maybe come up with maybe a little bit of funding to help them, or see about possibly putting money in that facility to upgrade it to where they could house more people. I know you said it was 28. I don't know what the max capacity is they could have if they brought everything up to code, but if it was something that has been addressed, I apologize if it already has or been asked, but is there possibly a way for the county and the city, not just so the city has to afford it, but maybe the county, because since this is, let's be honest, District 1 or District 3 is the county, and there are people that are on the outskirts that come into town and stay. If by generating some money for that to get them up to code would give us more beds, I would think the people would be more than happy to help that. Yeah,
I don't know whether Teresa Barnes, who is the director of of the warming centers on the call. I'd want probably someone from the warming center to speak to it. And I don't know if Ms. Barnes is, who's the director, is on today or not.
Yeah, I did not see her name, and I don't know if they've applied for grants in the past. I do have a meeting with Commission Chair Quayla tomorrow, and that was one of the things I was gonna ask about.
Yeah, I would just say too, when in the discussion about the warm center, my impression is they have 28 beds. The issue is that we were talking about was that we have a 90-day limitation. And to improve the safety standards and bring it up to code, that would allow them to have more days to be open. But I've been in there and really they're up to capacity. They, as far as beds, you see them laid out, unless they've had some, narrowed it down because of COVID restrictions, spread people out from when I was in there last time.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Pinkstaff was asking if the county or city or other entity, or if the warming centers try to pursue the funds to be able to do the building upgrades to allow it to be operated for maybe a longer period of time. In the past, the warming center has applied for some grant funds, from the city of Astoria through our community grant process. I don't think they applied for anything for that specific thing this year, but it sounds like the mayor's at least having some conversations with Chair Quayla.
Okay,
Yeah,
and I appreciate. I was just, like I said, wondering, I guess from the city council standpoint, would that be something you guys would be willing, if the county commissioners could get involved in this, to get both agencies working together to help them get their stuff up to code?
Yeah, from my perspective, particularly given, the briefing we got on essentially the need to establish unhoused campgrounds throughout the city, potentially, I would like to see the warming center be able to operate for longer periods of time. So I know that the county has a lot going on right now regarding housing and homelessness, and a lot of things are in motion that we just aren't fully up to speed on. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to meet with Commission Chair tomorrow. So yeah, good comment, and we'll definitely be looking into that. Are there any other public comments? Okay, with no other hands raised, then I'll turn it over to you to wrap us up, Mr. Estes.
So I don't have anything else at this point in time. What I'll just say is, again, follow-up items from this agenda item. We'll be looking for the abandoned vehicle ordinance, as the chief said, if not coming to Monday's ordinance, Monday's city council meeting, the first meeting in April. We're also looking at the community resource officer job description to be coming to city council over the next meeting or so. I think that we are going to need to figure out how best to flesh out community input for the various sites, and I think maybe, Mayor, if there are suggestions from the city council, staff will be able to brainstorm that, and I think we will want to be able to come back to you at a subsequent meeting to determine how best to roll that out and to be able to get that information to the community, and to be able to have that facilitated dialogue. So I don't have the specific recommendation at this point in time, but it's something I think we need to be working on to move this forward, if you would agree, Mayor and Council.
Yeah, I agree. There's probably a variety of ways to do that, and look forward to hearing your suggestions. Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sheriff Phillips, for joining us today. Thank you to Chief, and for the presentation, and thanks for everyone's input and for the community participation as well. Thank you.